Okay, this is the first slideshow that deals with modern theater. I actually have 3 slideshows, and if you watch all 3 of them, it makes a lot more sense. So I encourage you to do that. I'll try to be brief in these overviews, but there's a lot of information here. So when we talk about modern theater, we're getting past the ancient theater, the medieval times, the Renaissance, Royal theater, Romanticism. We're getting into the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's what we consider the modern period. So modern theater was a reaction to the world around it. And if you know your history, you know that there was massive social and intellectual changes going on in the late 19th century, early 20th century. We have Karl Marx, we have Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, all revolutionary thinkers. And fundamentally, they were questioning how the individual exists. And previously, it had been all based in religion, and now science is taking over and saying, you know, let's look at this a little bit more objectively. So there was a reassessment of the human animal going on. Okay. So when we talk about realism, this was the most pervasive influence on contemporary theater. It sought an objective realization of life and inspired by the scientific method, which was on the rise. And if you think about it, the scientific revolution was underway, and so it affected the artists because the artists were saying, wow, all of these stories are arising about science and how individuals' brains work and how psychology works. That's how Sigmund Freud influenced them. And so these stories were really interesting to them, stories of everyday life, stories of everyday social ills, for example. So they thought that by reaching objectivity, realism peeled away the surface of everyday to expose social ills. So things like alcoholism, divorce, adultery, drug abuse, things like this are starting to come into the art world. And instead of, big stories about fairies and ghosts and things like that, we're having stories about real everyday problems that previously people didn't want to see on the stage. But Sigmund Freud really brought that into the public discussion. So we say that this is launched with the plays of Henrik Ibsen, considered the father of realism. We're looking at the late 1800s here, 1879. The form was really mastered by Anton Chekhov, a Russian. His plays offer deeply complex characters that develop between the spoken lines. And the other slideshow I have has some more information about that. Then we talk about naturalism. Naturalism happened around the same time, and this was more influenced by Darwin because Darwin was very interested in naturally what happens. And so the artist took this as, okay, so let's get rid of the conventions, let's get rid of the dramatic structure that Aristotle really trained us on, and say what really happens when people sit around and read the newspaper all day long and don't talk to each other. And so the plays were a little bit slower paced. They didn't worry about the dramatic structure of the exposition and the climax and the rising action and the resolution. They just put people on the stage and let them do what they do, and they didn't worry about the fourth wall. So sometimes actors had their back to the audience, for example, or sometimes they would speak in a way that wasn't very clear because we couldn't hear them very well because that was more natural. So it wasn't a very popular movement. It didn't really go over very well with audiences, but it was an interesting phenomenon as the way they tried to create life itself on the stage. Then anti-realism came along. Here's another great example of art rebelling against itself. So realism, okay, great. There's only so much of that you can take. So many movements with radical dissimilarities came up, but they were united in opposing realism. So the first third of the 20th century we talk about as being the age of isms. Lots of experiments going on, movements with ideological tenets. We're going to see what happens if we just experiment with this kind of thing. Second third, then, was the age of stylization. There were movements that followed no single belief but mixed and matched from different styles, so very eclectic. Sometimes we call this postmodern. They would take a little bit of Shakespearean style with a little bit of dance, with a little bit of music, with a little bit of realism, and some big puppets or something like that. So a lot of mixture of things. It did not dispense with realism. It still had very real stories, but they enhanced it with anti-realistic styles. Okay, so here's the 5 types of anti-realism, and my other slideshow talks a little bit more about them. We could talk about the French avant-garde. Avant-garde means changing or advancing troops, so things that kind of take over. Nonsensical, vulgar satire of power was one example of the French avant-garde in plays of Alfred Jarry, like Ubu Roy. Intellectual comedies, George Bernard Shaw, you may have heard of him, the Irish writer. Very elegant and brilliant dialogue that transcends conventions. Expressionism, there's one of those isms. Representative play here is the hairy ape. So they would take a particular mood, for example, or a particular emotion, and they would blow it up on the stage. So you might have, oppression, and then you put it in the form of a huge foot coming down and oppressing people or something like that. And so bold exaggeration, overt symbols, heightened crescendos, very, very flamboyant kind of plays. Then you had meta theater. Meta theater basically means theater that talks about theater. And so again, here's that scientific method of what are we really doing? What is theater all about? And let's examine this through a microscope. So the representative play we talk about is 6 characters in search of an author. So it's right there in the title that these people on the stage don't really know what they're doing and what they're supposed to be doing and what the audiences want. And so it's a real examination of the art form itself. It's theater that becomes the content of the production is about theater. And then we talk about theater of cruelty. This movement was very absurd and very, very not well received because it was so cruel. Representative play we talk about is Jet of Blood by Anton Artaud. It destroys all representation, impossible to realize. He would say things like, and then bloody knives come up from the floor and giant bugs come in and destroy the crops or whatever it might be. And it sounds more like a movie script, but it was something that he just wanted it to be an experience that the audience would come in and see and be so overwhelmed that they would flee the theater in fear and they would be, almost cruelly treated as an audience in order to get the experience of what Artaud thought life was about. So that brings us to post-war anti-realistic theater. And consider all the artists in Europe, for example, coming up from underground after World War II as a metaphor to think of, and their friends are dead, and their cities are destroyed, and their countrysides are destroyed with bombs, and they're not feeling too good about life. So their art is going to reflect that, obviously. So 2 major forms grew up in importance, theater of alienation and theater of the absurd. And you can guess from these titles of these movements that they were a little bit pessimistic about life. And so these kinds of plays examined the absurdity of life. And a lot of times they were funny. They were very comic because they were very satirical about government and about propriety and about morality, because it had been so destroyed for them in World War II that they just couldn't see their way through a normal life, and they wanted to express that in their art. Okay, so theater of alienation, let's break that down a little bit. We talk about Bertolt Brecht, a very, very important name. You cannot study theater without studying Bertolt Brecht. He came up with a epic theater movement, is what we call it. His plays were very epic. They were about big, bold themes that spanned many years, a lot of times, is what we mean by epic. He repudiated the Aristotelian principles for sure. He didn't like the idea of catharsis because he felt like if the audience went through a catharsis and felt good by the end of the play because they had purged their emotions, then they wouldn't care about the play anymore. They'd go have their coffee and they'd be fine. He wanted people to be so upset by the end of the play and have such an unclear, obscure ending that they would go out and make things happen. They would go out and protest against their government and things like that. So that was his basic idea, is that if you let the audience get caught up emotionally in the play, then they're going to be complacent. But if you rile the audience up and get them angry, then they'll go out in the streets and they'll make social change. So that was a big part of his alienation theory. The characters, in other words, and the story is alienated from the audience to the point where the audience is upset and wants to do something about it. So then there's theater of the absurd, which is another similar type of movement. The idea that there's a sense of futility of all human action. And again, think about after World War II, this is how a lot of the artists felt. They flaunted ridiculous aesthetics. Their leading figure was Samuel Beckett. His works examine inescapable ignorance of human condition, which is how he felt after World War II, that the human condition is absurd and ridiculous, and what's the point? He wrote an archetypal absurdist play, Waiting for Godot. 2 tramps wait for someone who never arrives. It offers a parable without any message. It has whimsical and clownish tone throughout, so it's actually very funny and it's very playful, but at the same time the message is that life is futile. What's the point? And so you can see how you know, the world was affected by these artists and vice versa. So in today's theater, anti-realist drama has overtaken realism as a dominant dramatic form. So when you think about it, a lot of the plays you see, you know, they're not going to be so objective and realistic. They're going to have elements of all these things. And so now if you watch the other slideshow that I have, I go into a little bit more detail about some of these things.